Good afternoon, I'm Vashon Brown with the Midday News. A special welcome if you're watching on onespotmedia.com. Prime Minister Andrew Holness says Cabinet will be reviewing the Integrity Commission report on the state-owned oil refinery Petrojam prior to making an official statement. The report, which was tabled in the House of Representatives yesterday, outlines repeated instances of nepotism, corruption, breaches of government rules and procedures in relation to hiring and procurement. Now, Mr. Holness was asked to comment on the report during a digital media briefing this morning.
I have not yet had a chance to review the report in detail. I just got a copy of it like everyone else yesterday. I have glanced through and I've done some reading late last night on the summary findings. I still have to be advised on that. So the Cabinet, I'm certain we will go through it, we will review it between the Attorney General and myself and the Minister of Justice. I think this is a significant report, and we should commend the Integrity Commission for completing their investigation. It has taken some time, but as you would have known, it is a substantial document. So I'm happy that they have completed the report. I don't believe that this is the end of the matter because they have referred some matters for prosecution, and so that will be another round.
And still on reactions to the Integrity Commission's report, now the chairman of the People's National Party, Fitz Jackson, is adamant that there's nothing in the Integrity Commission report to implicate the Member of Parliament for East Kingston and Port Royal, Philip Paulwell. Now, the report released yesterday highlighted that Mr. Paulwell had asked Petrojam for $6 million to assist Camperdown High School with sporting facilities, with only $1.75 million of that amount spent so far. Here's O'Shane Masters with that report.
Where is the remainder of the $6 million that was provided to the MP for East Kingston and Port Royal, Philip Paulwell? That's the question now being asked following the report from the Integrity Commission on Tuesday. The funds were requested by the MP to help in developing sporting facilities at the Camperdown High School in his constituency, but the report noted that only $1.75 million was spent on surveying and architectural services. Mr. Paulwell told the Director of Investigations that the balance of the funds, which were handed over on April 7, 2017, is being held in an interest-bearing account at the National Commercial Bank.
Minister Paulwell never took the money, had any part to do it other than made a representation, as I say, which all MPs do. And the school acknowledged receipt of it, and they also provided documentation for their use of the money.
However, the Director of Investigations was not provided with official banking records by Mr. Paulwell or the Camperdown High School principal to confirm the balance at National Commercial Bank. On this point, Mr. Jackson says answers to at least two questions are needed from the school administration.
The 1-point-something million was spent. Was it legitimately spent by the school? Number one. Two, the remaining funds from what was received, what is the status of it, where it is, and it can be properly accounted for.
Principal of Camperdown High School, Valentine Bailey, told the Director of Investigation that no construction was undertaken to upgrade the school's sporting facility as the donation was not enough. The PNP chairman says he does not see any wrongdoing on the part of Mr. Paulwell.
A crime occurred. You don't say you just walk and lock up everybody. You say who is responsible for the crime. So before you ask me the question as to what action to be taken, Mr. Paulwell, you have to ask what wrongdoing Mr. Paulwell committed. And I don't hear that being said yet. So we can't reach to that point as yet. Has he done something wrong? Did he facilitate the crime? Is he complicit in it, and in what way?
Mr. Jackson says the party will not be seeking a meeting with Mr. Paulwell as there is nothing from him which needs clarification. Mr. Jackson says he supports calls for the Financial Investigation Division to launch an investigation into the funds.
We made that clear. In fact, don't forget, we are the ones who have been calling for these investigations. We are the ones who have been complaining about how long it takes the Integrity Commission to submit a report. From within the investigations at PAAC, we have called for these further investigation by the criminal investigation authorities, MOCA, Integrity Commission, and we are the ones who sought to have the Auditor General audit the accounts there. They didn't just happen out of the blue.
O'Shane Masters, TVJ News.
The findings of that Integrity Commission report, the Director of Investigation, David Gray, is questioning whether certain individuals were strategically placed in key positions at Petrojam to enable corruption at the entity. Debian Wright reports.
Mr. Gray said the strategic placements of certain individuals is evidenced by the fact that Petrojam Chairman Dr. Bahadur Singh, Board Member Richard Creary, Ike Johnson and Yolande Ramarak interviewed Floyd Grindley for the position of General Manager. Mr. Grindley was a part of the three-member interview panel which recruited Mrs. Ramarak to the post of Human Resource Development and Administration Manager, which oversees the grant of donations by the entity and recruitment of staff. After assuming the post of General Manager, Mr. Grindley promoted Ronique Budram Ford to Procurement Unit Head, a position which governs the award of contracts by Petrojam. In his report, Mr. Gray outlined relationships between key persons whose names came up in his investigation. He noted that Dr. Wheatley and Mr. Johnson are both friends of Dr. Bahadur Singh and were part of his wedding party. Meanwhile, the Director of Investigation concluded that there were instances of nepotism and gross improprieties and irregularities in the recruitment of Mrs. Ramarak, her brother and 3 others to posts at Petrojam. He said the circumstances in which Mrs. Ramarak was recruited as the Human Resource Development and Administration Manager are stained with irregularities as she failed to meet the minimum educational requirements for the position. The Director of Investigation also questioned the source of the newspaper advertisement for the post, as Petrojam officials say it was not published on their instructions. In addition, he said the circumstance in which Mrs. Ramarak received a more than $173,000 productivity incentive for the period February 13, 2017 to March 31, 2017 was irregular. He believes Mr. Grindley waived the probation period for Mrs. Ramarak to enable her to benefit from the company's productivity incentive scheme, for which she would not have otherwise qualified at the relevant time. And the Director of Investigation has found that Mrs. Ramarak was engaged in acts of corruption. He said the circumstances in which her brother Clayton Smith was recruited as an instrument and electrical technician are stained with irregularities. He was hired despite the fact that he did not score above the required grade of 75% on competency tests. Mr. Gray has concluded that the actions of Mrs. Ramarak in the recruitment of Mr. Smith is tantamount to nepotism, as she used her position to hire her brother, and there is no evidence she declared a conflict of interest.
And the Director of Investigation has recommended that fraud charges be considered against 3 former Petrojam officials in relation to surprise parties held for former Energy Minister Dr. Andrew Wheatley and former Petrojam Chairman Dr. Percival Bahadur Singh. Details from Kimon Witter.
He's of the opinion that Mrs. Ramharak, Mr. Grindley, and former head of procurement, Ronique Budram Ford, could be charged with fraud under the Forgery Act and the Larceny Act. Mr. Gray says consideration should also be given to prosecuting them for an offense of conspiracy to defraud Petrojam. He says these accounting officers breached the law by using public funds to host the parties, and repayment of the money does not negate the offense. The report of the Integrity Commission in relation to the parties details how both birthday parties were held without going through the proper procurement procedures, with documents being generated after the events to allow for payment. In one instance, Mrs. Ramharak arranged a villa for a surprise birthday party for Dr. Wheatley on January 9, 2018 at a cost of $11,260 or $1,370,850 Jamaican dollars. Despite correspondence with the hotel outlining that the event was a surprise birthday party, documents sent to the Chief Financial Officer for payment captioned the function as the naming of the Howard Paulwell building in Montego Bay. Meanwhile, the party held for Dr. Bahadur Singh on September 20, 2017 was described as a pre-strategic planning retreat meeting on the purchase order. The cost of this function was $10,506 or $1,357,950 Jamaican dollars. The Chief Financial Officer told the Commission he felt compelled to make the payments after they were authorized by Mr. Grindley.
And we'll have more from that Integrity Commission report in Primetime News later on. But for now, we take a break on the Midday News. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Continuing the news now. Prime Minister Andrew Holness has announced a Zone of Special Operations ZOSO in Greenwich Town in the St. Andrews South Police Division. Mr. Holness announced the measure this morning during a digital media briefing. He says the ZOSO is in response to activities of gangs and dons which have been posing a challenge to national security. He says despite a general reduction in crime, the St. Andrews South Police Division has recorded the highest number of murders in the country.
An analysis of the situation in the Greenwich Town area has revealed that the community continues to be characterized by increased gang-related violence and criminal activities as the gangs compete for area dominance, and overall the intervention in the space will be geared at the urgent need to save lives and setting the conditions for and the delivery of effective social interventions to reduce social vulnerability to violence and crime.
And taming Jamaica's crime monster is no easy feat, but the National Security Minister says the government has been spending big to do it and has been reaping some reward. But Dr. Horace Chang says no one government can truly claim success in crime fighting until the country's murder rate dips below 800 per year. He was making his contribution to the sectoral debate in Parliament on Tuesday. That report from Krista Campbell.
National Security Minister Dr. Horace Chang firing point after point about Jamaica's crime epidemic dating back 50 years. And he stressed it's time for parliamentarians on both sides of the aisle to stop using politics to claim success in addressing the long-standing issue. He pointed to a February 1972 newspaper article which painted a picture of rising crime in Montego Bay, St. James, similar to the current crime environment in Western Jamaica and other parts of the island.
My friend from Central Manchester used every possible opportunity to call attention to what he seems to regard as a commendable reduction in homicide rate over the period 2012 to 2015. But truth be told, over the last 15 years, there have been a minimum of 1,000 Jamaican lives lost as a result of homicide each year. No fewer than 1,000 Jamaican lives lost every single year since 2005. So what really is there to be commended? By this measure, none of us can claim success.
Still, he insists it was a Jamaica Labour Party administration which helped achieve the declining murder rate for that 4-year period.
What explained the reduction in homicide from 2011 to 2014 was the investment made by a former government, Prime Minister Golding 2009, when the single year over the last 20 years in which any significant investment was made in the police force. Security operations allowed for dismantling of the security operations on the SOE that allowed for the dismantling of criminal networks that caused a decline in homicide in the period thereafter. The subsequent government failed to invest in Jamaica's security apparatus, and that explained the upward trend in homicide rates from 2015 onwards.
According to him, the country must aim to keep murders below 800 per year if it is to claim any success in crime fighting. And he says until that happens, the zones of special operations and the states of public emergency must remain as support for other security measures. He insists persons who live and work in areas where SOEs and ZOSOs have been implemented attest to their effectiveness.
The measure of success includes their ability to sleep at nights and the freedom to walk about their community free of fear. Across the western region of the island, where state of public emergency has been held in place the longest, the security experts can report that violent crimes are at a 20-year low, in particularly in the parish of St. James, as a matter of fact. Gun seizures, Mr. Speaker, are at all-time high.
Dr. Chang says the $5.2 billion budget for national security in the 2019-2020 fiscal year has helped to modernize and restructure the police force. He notes that part of that reform has resulted in greater accountability, especially for those in authority. He pointed to the recently concluded trial involving the Manchester Municipal Corporation, which led to the convictions of several public officials, as well as increased international partnerships, which led to the recent arrests of 3 St. James-based constables for drug smuggling in the U.S. Pointing to complaints against members of the police force, he says 2019 recorded the lowest number of police fatal shootings, 85. Of that number, the Independent Commission of Investigations, INDECOM, only recommended that 4 police be charged, and 2 of those cases were domestic-related. Krista Campbell, TVJ News.
The Attorney General's Chamber is struggling with a lack of resources, particularly for dealing with the heavy workload. That's according to Attorney General Marlene Malahou-Fort. In her contribution to the sectoral debate in Parliament yesterday, Mrs. Malahou-Fort said the Chamber has received 597 new files between April and May this year. However, there are not enough attorneys to conduct reviews efficiently.
The ministries, departments and agencies of government to provide us with full comprehensive instructions in a timely manner. Our major challenge is so severe, Mr. Speaker, and it is compounded by the fact that we do not have enough attorneys in the chambers to deal with the workload and to adequately manage what comes in to us. The Commercial Affairs Division, Mr. Speaker, currently has a staff complement of 4 attorneys, and that is woefully insufficient to allow for timely review of the complex commercial matters we deal with on behalf of the government.
Despite the challenges, Mrs. Malahou-Fort said the Chamber is making progress. She explained that up to March of this year, the Chamber has paid out more than $200 million in judgment debts and more than $100 million in settlements.
This, Mr. Speaker, has gone a long way in alleviating the hurt and the distress of those who have gotten judgments and those who have been wronged by agents of the state. And it is true, Mr. Speaker, that one of the focus of this administration was to bring payments up to date. For a long time, they were outstanding and lingering, but thankfully we have made such good progress in this regard.
Here now is a preview of what's coming up in this evening's health report.
In the next edition of the health report, we'll look at heat stroke.
That is one of the reasons why we need to plant as many trees as possible to decrease the temperature of the atmosphere, especially in built-up areas. And the environmental conditions are extremely important. And you have to have these trees not only provide shade to provide shade for you, or to provide exchange when you breathe from pollutants, but also to ensure that the conditions of climate change, the impact of climate change, are mitigated.
That's the health report this evening in Primetime News. And now for today's healthy living tip. Wear loose-fitting, lightweight clothing. Protect yourself against sunburn. Take extra precautions with certain medications and drink plenty of fluids.
News now from the region. Some tourists visiting Antigua and Barbuda are threatening to take legal action against the country over mandatory coronavirus testing protocols upon arrival to the islands. Prime Minister Gaston Brown said the challenge would force the country's health officials to change its current health and safety protocols. Now, Mr. Brown said that tourists who tested positive last week did not follow the mandatory quarantine orders and booked flights back to the United States the day after receiving the diagnosis. Several tourists arriving in Antigua and Barbuda said it was a violation of their rights to be forced to take a coronavirus test and to stay on the island until the quarantine period is complete. As a result, the government will now allow visitors to be tested before arriving. And that's the Midday News. I'm Vashon Brown. Join us at 7 for Primetime News Package. On behalf of the news, sports and production teams, have a good afternoon.